"Shut up, or I'll make you," her husband threatened, unaware the Mafia boss was at the next table. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let's dive into today's story. On a cold evening in downtown New York, Julia sat at a high-end restaurant, the kind where the chandeliers seemed to glitter in their own world of luxury. The soft hum of conversations blended with the clinking of fine wine glasses, creating an atmosphere that felt almost dreamlike. Yet, Julia felt anything but at ease. Her husband, Jason, sat across from her, his fingers wrapped around a glass of scotch, his gaze sharp and unyielding. The tension between them had been building for weeks, ever since Julia had mentioned wanting to return to work after taking some time off to focus on their family. Jason, a man of control and pride, didn't take kindly to her desire for independence. He had made it clear that he preferred things the way they were, with her at home, managing their life, and attending to his every need. But Julia wasn't that woman anymore. The truth was, she wanted something for herself. She wanted to feel like she had a voice, like she mattered outside of being just Jason's wife. That night, the conflict finally boiled over. Jason, already 3 scotches deep, slammed his glass down on the table, making the silverware jolt with a loud clink. "I told you," he snapped, his voice low but threatening. "You're not going anywhere. Shut up and do what you're told, or I'll make you." Julia's heart skipped a beat. The words were meant to hurt, to belittle her, but there was something else in his eyes, a deep, simmering rage that she hadn't seen before. She wasn't sure whether it was the alcohol or his true feelings finally coming to light, but the cruelty in his voice made her stomach churn. She glanced around, hoping for some kind of escape, but the restaurant was full of strangers, none of whom could help her. Her mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next, when suddenly, she felt a presence. It was as if the room had shifted, as if the air itself had changed. She looked up to see a tall figure standing by the entrance. A man in a perfectly tailored black suit, with sharp features and an aura of power that made everyone in the room instinctively pause. The man's eyes met hers for a brief moment before he turned his attention to Jason. Julia felt her pulse quicken, unsure of what was happening, but there was something about this man, something that made her feel as if she were no longer alone. Jason didn't seem to notice the shift in the atmosphere. He was too consumed by his anger, too fixated on making Julia feel small. But the stranger, the man in the suit, was not just any patron. As he walked toward their table, his presence felt like a warning, like the quiet before a storm. Julia's breath caught in her throat as the man approached, his eyes locking onto Jason with a chilling calmness. "You don't speak to her like that," the man said, his voice deep and controlled, cutting through the tension in the air. Jason blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He looked up at the stranger, his face flushed with anger, but also something else. A flicker of fear? The man didn't wait for a response. He gestured to one of the bodyguards who had followed him into the restaurant, a towering figure in a dark suit, who moved to stand behind Jason. "You will leave now, or there will be consequences," the man continued, his words carrying the weight of someone used to being obeyed. Jason opened his mouth, probably to argue, but then, as if finally realizing who he was dealing with, he froze. The Mafia boss, without another word, turned his attention back to Julia. His eyes softened slightly, just for a moment, before he spoke again. "You're not going back to that life, Julia. You're free to live as you choose." Julia's heart raced, her pulse pounding in her ears as the chilling words hung in the air. Jason's threat still echoed in the restaurant, but now, something had changed. The Mafia boss who had intervened was standing tall beside their table, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. Julia's eyes were wide, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and disbelief. She had never imagined that her night would unfold like this. The last thing she had expected was to be rescued by a complete stranger, a man who seemed more like a shadow than a person. Jason, meanwhile, had gone eerily quiet. The fear in his eyes was undeniable now as he stared at the man who had stepped into their confrontation. The stranger, calm and composed, didn't show a hint of aggression, but his words held the weight of something far more dangerous. "You don't speak to her like that," the Mafia boss said again, his voice a steady, quiet force. Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked around, trying to gauge the situation, but the aura of power around the man made it clear that any attempt at resistance would be futile. As the Mafia boss's words sank in, Jason slowly pushed back his chair, realizing he had no choice but to comply. The guards surrounding him seemed to anticipate his every move, as if they had seen this kind of scenario 1,000 times before. "You will leave now," the Mafia boss instructed, his tone unwavering, "or there will be consequences." Jason glanced at Julia, his face contorting with anger, but he knew he was beaten. Slowly, he stood up, his hands trembling as he adjusted his suit jacket, and without another word, he turned and walked out of the restaurant, the tension lifting with every step he took. Julia, still stunned by the turn of events, couldn't quite believe what had just happened. The entire restaurant had gone silent. People were watching, but no one dared to speak. She felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief, because Jason was gone, but fear, because she had no idea who this man was or why he had intervened. The Mafia boss turned his attention back to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. For a moment, she felt like she couldn't breathe. There was something about him, something that both terrified and intrigued her. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, his gaze softening just a touch. Julia nodded slowly, still trying to gather her thoughts. "Yes, I think so." Her voice felt small, but the man in front of her seemed to understand. He didn't push her to say more. Instead, he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Good," he said, his deep voice cutting through the lingering tension. "You don't have to worry about him anymore." Julia didn't know what to say. Her mind was still racing, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few minutes. The Mafia boss had not only saved her from Jason's cruelty, but now, he was standing before her, offering her protection. She couldn't understand why he had done it, why he cared. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The man smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was a smile that spoke of power, control, and secrets. "That's not important right now," he said. "What matters is that you're safe." His words were like a balm to her frayed nerves, but they also sparked 1,000 questions. Who was he? Why had he stepped in? And what did this mean for her future? Before she could voice any of these questions, the Mafia boss's gaze softened, and he gave a slight tilt of his head toward the exit. "Come with me," he said simply. "You shouldn't be alone after something like that." Julia hesitated, the thought of leaving with a stranger still making her uneasy, but deep down, she knew she had no other option. Jason was gone, and now, she had no idea what would happen next. Slowly, she stood up, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. The Mafia boss led the way toward the door, his presence almost magnetic as people stepped aside to let him pass. Julia followed, her heart pounding in her chest. What was happening to her life? As they stepped into the night, the cool air hit her skin, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of freedom. But she also knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something much more complicated, and she had no idea where it would take her. Julia followed the man in the tailored black suit, her heart pounding with every step she took. She had just escaped from a nightmare, or at least she thought she had. But now, walking behind the stranger, the Mafia boss, as she was starting to suspect, she couldn't shake. The feeling that this new world she was stepping into was just as dangerous as the one she had left behind. The cool night air hit her face as she exited the restaurant, and she could hear the sound of traffic in the distance. The bustling city seemed so far removed from the quiet, tense moment she had just left. The Mafia boss didn't look back, but she could feel his presence pulling her forward, guiding her through the chaos of the city. As they reached the black car parked outside the restaurant, a sleek vehicle that screamed wealth and power, he opened the door for her. "Get in," he said, his voice commanding yet calm. Julia hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should trust him. The man was a complete stranger, and yet, she had never felt more certain that he was the only person who could offer her protection in that moment. With a deep breath, she slid into the car, the leather seats cold against her skin. The man followed her in, sitting across from her with a slight lean against the backrest, his gaze never leaving her face. He looked like he could read her every thought, and it made her uneasy. The driver, a man dressed in a similar dark suit, started the engine, and they were off, weaving through the streets of New York City. Julia stared out the window, her mind racing. What was she getting herself into? Why had this man intervened when he didn't have to? And most importantly, where was this car taking her? "You're safe now," the man said, breaking the silence. His voice was deep, like a voice that commanded respect, but there was something oddly comforting in it as well. Julia turned to face him, her stomach still tied in knots. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man didn't answer immediately. He simply studied her for a moment, his sharp eyes piercing through the shadows of the car. "That doesn't matter right now," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "What matters is that you're out of harm's way. Your husband won't hurt you again." Julia's throat tightened at the mention of Jason. Her thoughts immediately turned back to the man who had been the source of so much of her pain, the man who had controlled her life for years. Jason had always been possessive, but tonight, something had snapped. She had seen a side of him she had never thought possible. You don't understand," she said, her voice shaky. I don't know what to do now." The man's eyes softened just a fraction. "I understand more than you think," he said quietly. "But you're not alone. I'll make sure of that." Julia felt a strange sense of comfort in his words, though she knew deep down she shouldn't. He was still a stranger. She didn't know him, didn't know what he was capable of, but something in her gut told her he wasn't someone who would let her down. The car turned onto a quieter street, and the buildings around them grew taller and more imposing. The city seemed to disappear as they entered a part of town Julia had never seen before. The streets here were empty, the buildings dark and quiet, and as the car pulled up to a large, intimidating mansion, Julia felt her breath catch in her throat. "This is where you'll be staying," the Mafia boss said, as if reading her thoughts. "For now, you're safe here. No one will bother you." Julia looked up at the mansion in disbelief. It was massive, with tall stone walls and wrought iron gates that seemed to close off the world from the outside. The entire place exuded power, wealth, and an unsettling sense of danger. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "My home," he replied simply. "And for the time being, it's yours as well." Julia's mind raced. She had no idea what kind of man this was, but she knew one thing for sure. Her life had just changed in ways she couldn't even begin to comprehend. The car stopped in front of the gates, and one of the men in dark suits opened the door for them. The Mafia boss stepped out first, then offered his hand to Julia. She hesitated for a moment before taking it, stepping out of the car and onto the cold, polished stone driveway. As they walked up to the mansion, Julia couldn't help but feel like she was stepping into a different world. The air felt thick with secrets, with things she didn't understand. But she was also scared of what would happen next, scared of what she had just gotten herself into. The doors of the mansion opened as they approached, revealing a grand foyer with marble floors and expensive artwork hanging on the walls. The man led her inside, and Julia couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the opulence of it all. The moment they stepped into the mansion, she knew there was no turning back. Julia stepped into the mansion, her heart still pounding from the chaos of the night. The grand foyer stretched out before her, with marble floors that gleamed under the chandelier's soft light. She had never seen anything like it, the towering walls lined with rich, dark wood, and the opulent paintings that hung at perfect angles. It felt like stepping into another world entirely, a world of wealth, power, and danger. The Mafia boss walked ahead, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the mansion, and Julia followed closely behind, unsure of what to expect next. She had been swept away from the life she knew, and now she was standing in the heart of this strange and intimidating place. The man stopped in front of a large door and turned to face her, his eyes briefly meeting hers. "This is where you'll be staying," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "No one will bother you here." Julia nodded, still processing everything that had happened. The tension from her previous life with Jason felt like a distant memory, yet the fear that lingered in her chest was still very real. She had no idea who this man was or what he wanted, but in that moment, she was too exhausted to argue. The door opened, and she stepped into the room. The space was massive, a bedroom fit for royalty, with a king-sized bed draped in luxurious linens, a sitting area with plush velvet chairs, and a window that overlooked a garden. The soft glow of the city lights outside mixed with the warmth of the room, creating a feeling of security, even if she didn't fully trust it. "You'll find everything you need here," the Mafia boss said, his tone softer than before. "There's no need to worry. You're safe." Julia didn't know how to respond. Safe. She had spent years in a relationship that had promised safety, but only delivered control and fear. Now, she was being offered something she didn't quite understand. Protection, but at what cost? As if reading her mind, the Mafia boss continued, "I understand you have questions, and I'm willing to answer them when you're ready." He walked to the door, pausing before he left. "But for now, rest. You've been through a lot." And with that, he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him. Julia stood in the center of the room, the weight of the day settling heavily on her shoulders. She felt like a bird trapped in a gilded cage, unsure of whether the freedom she had been given was real or just another form of imprisonment. The idea of rest seemed impossible, but she was too tired to do anything else. She sank into the chair by the window, staring out at the dark skyline, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What was she going to do now? What was this man's game? And most importantly, why had he stepped in to protect her? She had no answers, and the uncertainty gnawed at her. As the minutes passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced around the room, half expecting to see the Mafia boss or one of his men standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. The mansion was eerily quiet, save for the distant hum of the city. She stood up, pacing the room, her mind still racing. She couldn't stay here forever, could she? She had never felt more out of place. But what choice did she have? She couldn't go back to Jason. That life was over, even if she couldn't yet bring herself to believe it. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She knew she had to contact someone, a friend, a family member, someone who could help her make sense of this situation. But as she looked at her contacts, her finger hovered over the screen. Who could she trust? Her family had been distant for years, and her friends were all back in her old life, the life she was trying to escape. Julia sank back into the chair, dropping her phone onto the table. She felt more alone than ever. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, and before she could even react, the door opened again. The Mafia boss stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the room. Julia's breath caught in her throat. "I know you have questions," he said, his voice steady. "And I promise you, I'll answer them. But first, I need you to understand something." He walked toward her, his gaze unwavering. "You're under my protection now. That means no one can hurt you. Not your husband, not anyone from your past. I'll take care of everything." Julia's chest tightened. "Why? Why are you helping me?" The words came out before she could stop them, and she felt vulnerable for asking them. He paused for a moment, his dark eyes studying her. "Because you deserve better," he said simply. "And because no one should have to live in fear, not even you." His words hit her harder than she expected. She had always thought she was weak, that she couldn't escape her situation. But here, in this strange place, with this mysterious man, she felt something else. She felt like she had a chance. But what kind of chance was it? Julia opened her mouth to ask another question, but he held up a hand, stopping her. "Rest now. Tomorrow, we'll talk more. There's much for you to understand." He turned and left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Julia sat there for a long time, her thoughts still spinning. But slowly, as the hours passed, her body began to succumb to exhaustion. She lay down on the bed, her mind heavy with uncertainty, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she closed her eyes and allowed herself to sleep. The next morning, Julia woke up in the mansion, her mind still clouded with confusion. The events of the previous night played on a loop in her head, and no matter how hard she tried to focus on the new reality around her, she felt like she was floating in a dream. The mansion, the stranger who had saved her, Jason's rage, it all seemed too surreal. She sat up in the massive bed, her fingers running through her hair as she stared at the grand windows, the morning light spilling into the room. It had been a long time since she'd felt this uncertain, this vulnerable. Yet, there was a strange sense of peace in the silence of the room. She wasn't being yelled at. She wasn't afraid. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt safe. But that safety came with questions, and Julia couldn't ignore them any longer. She needed answers. Her gaze turned toward the door as the sound of footsteps approached. The door opened without a knock, and in stepped the Mafia boss. His presence filled the room instantly, just as it had the night before. He seemed so sure of himself, so commanding. His sharp features were set in an expression of calm focus. But there was a hint of something else in his eyes, an understanding of her fear, perhaps. "Good morning," he said, his voice still smooth, but with an undertone of something more serious. "I trust you slept well." Julia nodded, unsure of what to say. She felt a little embarrassed for not knowing how to react to this strange new world she had been thrust into. She had never expected her life to take such a dramatic turn. "I did," she said quietly. "Thank you for everything." The Mafia boss smiled, a hint of warmth in his otherwise stoic expression. "You don't need to thank me. It's my job to protect you now." His words echoed in her mind. Her job? To protect her? She had no idea what kind of man this was or what kind of world he inhabited, but his words left her with no doubt that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Julia sat up straighter, her mind racing with questions. "Why are you helping me?" she asked before she could stop herself. It was the question that had been gnawing at her since last night, the question that was so full of fear and curiosity. The Mafia boss looked at her for a long moment, his gaze intense, almost as though he were deciding how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke, his voice lower than before. "Because you deserve better," he said simply. "Because no one should live in fear, not even you." Julia felt her breath catch. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Not Jason. Not anyone. She had spent so many years feeling small, insignificant, and trapped. But in this moment, with this man standing before her, she felt something shift inside her. She felt a glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could start over. "I'm not used to this," she whispered, almost to herself. To someone actually caring. The Mafia boss took a step closer, his presence overwhelming yet oddly comforting. "You don't have to be used to it," he replied. "You're not alone anymore." Julia closed her eyes for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her like a blanket. It was strange, but she felt something stir in her chest. She was used to pain, to disappointment, but the idea of kindness, of protection, was foreign to her. Yet it felt like something she could get used to. "What happens now?" she asked, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. The Mafia boss paused, his eyes scanning her face as if weighing her question. "Now, we take things one step at a time," he said. "You're free of him, Julia. But there are things you need to understand about the world I live in. Things that can help you stay safe." Julia nodded, her heart pounding at the thought of learning about the world he was part of. She had no idea what she was getting herself into, but one thing was clear. This was a turning point in her life, one she couldn't ignore. "I'll stay out of your way," she said, almost nervously. "I just want to figure things out. To find a way to live without fear." The Mafia boss regarded her quietly for a moment, and then, as if to reassure her, he spoke again. "That's exactly what I'm offering you," he said. "A life without fear. But you need to trust me, Julia. Trust me to help you find that peace." Julia swallowed hard. Trust. It was a difficult thing for her to give, especially after everything she had been through. But in this moment, standing before a man who had no reason to help her but still had, she felt something stirring deep inside her. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she might be able to walk it without looking over her shoulder. The Mafia boss turned to leave, his footsteps echoing in the grand hallway outside. Before he exited, he glanced back at her one last time. "Rest for now," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "Tomorrow, we'll talk about what comes next." With that, he left, leaving Julia alone with her thoughts. But this time, she didn't feel alone. She felt like she had a chance. A real chance at something different. Something better. Julia awoke the next morning to the quiet hum of the mansion, the soft light of the early morning casting gentle shadows across the room. She sat up slowly, her mind still swirling with the events of yesterday. The encounter with Jason, the man in the black suit, and the strange new life she had found herself in were all too much to process at once. But there was one thing she knew for sure now. She had a chance. A real chance at escaping the fear and control that had defined her life for so long. As she stood and looked around the spacious room, She noticed the grand windows that looked out onto a manicured garden. The view was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was almost surreal, a life so different from her cramped apartment in the city. She felt a sudden sense of unease. Could she really live here, in this mansion, surrounded by so much wealth and power? Was she truly safe? As if on cue, there was a soft knock on the door. Before she could answer, the door opened, and in stepped the Mafia boss. He looked just as composed as before, his dark suit impeccable, his presence immediately commanding the room. Julia had grown used to the quiet authority that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But today, she noticed something else in his eyes, something that resembled concern. "How did you sleep?" he asked, his voice steady but gentle. "I slept. Okay," Julia replied, unsure of how to express the mix of emotions she was feeling. "Thank you for everything." The Mafia boss nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment before he spoke again. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "It's my job to protect you now. I made sure Jason won't hurt you again." Julia's heart clenched at the mention of Jason. The memories of his anger, his threats, and the control he had over her life were still fresh in her mind. "You don't have to worry about him," the Mafia boss continued, his voice soft but unwavering. "He won't be able to touch you again." Julia didn't know how to respond. She wanted to believe him, to believe that she was truly safe, but the years of fear and manipulation had left deep scars. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice barely a whisper. The Mafia boss stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "Now," he said, "we take things one step at a time. You're free of him, but there are things you need to understand about the world I live in. You need to know how to protect yourself." Julia nodded, her mind racing with questions. What kind of world was he talking about? And how was she supposed to fit into it? "I don't know how to live like this," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to live without fear." The Mafia boss regarded her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then, without warning, he reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of dominance, but one of reassurance. "You'll learn," he said softly. "You'll learn to trust yourself again. And I'll help you with that." His words struck a chord deep within her. Trust. It had been so long since she had trusted anyone, least of all herself. But there was something about the way he spoke, with certainty, with authority, yet without a hint of malice, that made her want to believe him. "What if I can't?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "What if I can't escape the fear?" The Mafia boss gave her a steady, unwavering look. "You will," he said. "I promise you will." He turned away, walking toward the door. "But for now, rest. We'll talk more later." Julia watched him leave, her mind still spinning with confusion and doubt. She had no idea what her future would look like, but one thing was certain. She was no longer the person she had been. The fear that had once ruled her life was beginning to fade, replaced by something else, something she couldn't yet name. It was a strange feeling, but one she was starting to embrace. As the door closed behind him, Julia walked to the window and looked out at the sprawling garden below. She could hear the faint sound of birds chirping in the distance, and the sun was rising higher in the sky. The mansion was quiet, almost too quiet, but for the first time in a long while, Julia felt a sense of calm settle over her. It wasn't the calm of knowing everything would be okay, but the calm of knowing that, for the first time, she had a choice. A choice to live differently. A choice to live without fear. And that, she realized, was all she needed to begin. The following days in the mansion felt like a blur, a mix of uncertainty and quiet reflection. Julia had never experienced anything like this before. Her mind was still catching up to the idea that her life had taken such a drastic turn. For years, she had been trapped in a cycle of fear, guilt, and submission. But now, in the grand, empty halls of the mansion, she found herself facing a new reality. She could breathe. It was strange, almost foreign, but it was the first time she felt truly free. But freedom, she was quickly learning, came with its own set of challenges. The Mafia boss had made it clear that he was offering her protection, but what did that mean? Was she expected to live in his world now? Was she meant to trust him fully? The more she thought about it, the more questions piled up in her mind. But each time she felt the pull of uncertainty, the memory of his calm, unwavering presence reassured her. He had told her she was safe, and somehow, she believed him. It was a trust that came with difficulty, but she couldn't deny that there was something about him, something that made her feel as though he genuinely cared. The following morning, she decided it was time to confront him, to ask the questions that had been weighing on her. She couldn't continue living in this mansion without understanding what kind of life she was being offered, what kind of man was offering it. The mansion's staff had been kind but distant, offering her everything she could need, but never speaking much beyond polite pleasantries. She had yet to see the Mafia boss again since the night he rescued her. She had no idea what his day-to-day life was like, and part of her wondered if she would ever truly be free of him, or if she would simply become another part of his empire. Julia dressed carefully, her thoughts scattered as she tried to gather the courage to face him. She had never been one to assert herself, to take control of her own life, but she had no choice now. She needed answers. As she made her way to the study, the sound of her heels echoing through the halls, she took a deep breath. She didn't know what would come next, but she couldn't stay silent anymore. She reached the door and knocked gently, waiting for permission to enter. It was a moment of vulnerability she hadn't expected to experience, but there was no turning back now. "Come in," came the familiar voice from within. Julia stepped into the study and found him sitting at a large desk, papers spread out before him. He didn't look up immediately, his focus entirely on the documents in front of him. She stood at the door for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what to say. Finally, she cleared her throat and spoke. "I need to talk to you." The Mafia boss glanced up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. There was no surprise in his gaze, no irritation. He simply gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," he said, his voice calm and measured. Julia took a seat, feeling a strange sense of anticipation hanging in the air. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come right away. Instead, she simply stared at him, trying to figure out where to start. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. "Why are you helping me? I don't understand." The Mafia boss leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him, as if considering her question. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Julia felt her anxiety begin to grow. Was he going to dismiss her, tell her that it wasn't her place to ask? But instead, he spoke, his tone surprisingly soft. "Because you deserve a life without fear, Julia," he said simply. "You deserve to live on your own terms. No one should have control over you the way he did." His words hit her harder than she expected. For the first time in her life, someone was speaking to her like she mattered. It wasn't just about protection. It was about her freedom, her future. "But what do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why are you offering me this? What's the catch?" The Mafia boss looked at her for a long time, his gaze unwavering. "There is no catch," he said, his voice firm. "You can walk away at any time. But I can promise you this. If you stay, you'll have the chance to build a life for yourself. A life that isn't controlled by anyone." Julia swallowed hard, his words sinking in. She had spent so many years under Jason's control, so many years questioning her own worth, that the idea of being free, truly free, was almost too much to grasp. She had never imagined a life where she could choose for herself, where she wasn't at the mercy of someone else's desires. "I don't know how to live like that," she admitted quietly. "I've never known anything else." The Mafia boss nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "It will take time," he said. "But you'll learn. You'll learn to trust yourself again." Julia sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words settling over her. Could she really learn to trust herself? Could she truly escape the life she had known for so long? She didn't know. But one thing was certain. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance. A real chance. And maybe that was all she needed to start. The next few days passed in a blur for Julia. She woke each morning in the mansion, surrounded by luxury and silence, trying to find a new rhythm to her life. The Mafia boss, Adriano, had kept his distance, allowing her time to adjust, but each passing day left her with more questions. The more she thought about her life before, with Jason, the more her past seemed like a distant memory, something she couldn't quite touch. But even in this new, strange world, she couldn't shake the feelings of doubt. Was she really safe here? And what exactly did Adriano want from her? She had begun to piece together some answers, but the bigger picture still eluded her. She had been given a second chance, but at what cost? Adriano's protection felt genuine, but it also felt like a contract she hadn't fully signed. There was a part of her that wondered if there was something more she didn't understand. One afternoon, as Julia wandered through the mansion, she found herself in a quiet hallway, a place she hadn't explored before. The walls were lined with old, framed photographs, family portraits, landscapes, and candid shots that seemed out of place in such an imposing house. The further she walked, the more she felt as though she was trespassing on something personal. As she reached the end of the hall, a door creaked open, and Adriano stepped out. His presence was as commanding as always, but today, there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate. "I see you've been exploring," he said, his voice soft but still carrying the weight of authority. Julia didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. "This is a large house," she said, trying to sound casual. "I wasn't sure where I was going." Adriano smiled, but it wasn't one of his usual cold, calculated smiles. It was warmer, softer, almost like he was trying to put her at ease. "You don't have to worry about being lost here," he said. "You're safe." Julia swallowed hard. Safe. It was the word he used often, but she still didn't fully understand what it meant. Safe from what? And safe for how long? Adriano must have sensed her unease, because he took a step toward her, his expression shifting to something more serious. "I know you have questions," he said, "and I know you're not ready to trust me completely, but I'm offering you something you've never had before: peace." Peace. The word hung in the air between them. Julia wasn't sure if she could ever believe in peace again, not after everything she had been through. She had lived so long in fear, under the shadow of Jason's control, that the idea of a life without constant worry seemed almost impossible. But looking at Adriano, something told her that this was a man who could make it happen. She had been given a choice, and she was starting to realize that the choice wasn't just about whether to stay or leave the mansion. It was about whether she would continue to let fear rule her life, or if she would take a chance on something new. "I don't know if I can trust you," Julia said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore." Adriano didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You don't have to trust me yet," he said. "But I promise you, I'll make sure no one hurts you again. You'll never have to fear him, or anyone, again." Julia felt a chill run through her. There was something in Adriano's voice, something deep and unshakable, that made her believe him. The promise wasn't just empty words. It was a guarantee. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this for me?" Adriano's gaze softened, and for the first time, Julia saw a flicker of something that wasn't just power or control in his eyes. "Because you deserve better," he said simply. "You deserve a life where you don't have to live in fear, where you can choose what happens to you. That's what I'm offering you." Julia's heart raced. It was the first time someone had spoken to her like she was worth something more than just a pawn in someone else's game. She had always felt like she was meant to be controlled, that she was only as valuable as her ability to satisfy others. But now, here was someone who was offering her a choice, a chance at something she had never dared to dream of. "But what about my past?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it follows me here?" Adriano's expression hardened, the steel in his eyes returning. "Your past will never touch you again," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'll make sure of that." There was no doubt in his words. No hesitation. It was the certainty of someone who had the power to make things happen, and for the first time, Julia felt like she was standing at the edge of a new beginning. She had spent so long living in fear, so long believing that she had no choice, that she had forgotten what it was like to have a future of her own. But now, standing in front of Adriano, she realized that she had a choice. And that choice was hers to make. "I'm ready," she said, surprising even herself with the words. Adriano's eyes softened, just for a moment, before he gave her a small nod. "Good," he said, his voice quiet but filled with approval. "We'll begin tomorrow. For now, rest. You've earned it." Julia watched as he turned and walked away, the weight of his words sinking in. She had made her choice. And now, for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. Julia woke up the next morning feeling an unfamiliar calm. The bed beneath her was soft, the linen smooth against her skin, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. It was as if she had crossed into a new chapter of her life, one where she wasn't constantly watching her back, waiting for the next outburst, the next threat from Jason. She had been living in the shadow of fear for so long. It was hard to believe this new reality could be real. As the day unfolded, Julia began to settle into the mansion. It was a world so different from the one she had known, but she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of comfort in its cold, luxurious walls. Adriano had kept his word. The mansion, with its marble floors and towering windows, had become her sanctuary, a place where she could breathe freely. But even in this new world, there were moments when doubt crept in. She had so many questions, so many uncertainties about Adriano and his intentions. Why had he stepped in to protect her? What did he expect in return? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his offer of protection than he was letting on. The answer came to her that afternoon, when Adriano finally sat down with her. He had been busy with his own affairs, but today, he had time to talk. Julia found herself in the study once again, seated across from him at a large oak desk. He looked at her with those steady, dark eyes of his, and for the first time, she saw a hint of vulnerability. "You have questions," he said, his voice calm, as always. Julia nodded. "I do. I don't know what to make of all of this." "Why me? Why did you help me?" Adriano leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. He took a moment to answer, as if weighing his words carefully. "Because you deserve better," he said simply. "No one should live in fear, Julia. Not even you." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She had heard those words before, from others, but they had never felt so genuine, never so powerful. "But why me?" she repeated, her voice shaking slightly. "What do you want from me?" Adriano's gaze softened, and he leaned forward slightly, as if to bridge the distance between them. "Nothing, Julia. I want nothing from you," he said, his tone quiet but firm. "I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm giving you a chance to live a life free from fear. That's all." Julia looked at him, her heart racing. She had heard the words, but the reality of them was still sinking in. Could she really trust him? Could she trust herself? "And what about your world?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know anything about your life, Adriano. What does it mean to be protected by someone like you?" Adriano's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that resembled a distant memory. "You don't need to know everything right now," he said softly. "But I can promise you this. I will never let anything happen to you. No one will ever hurt you again, not as long as I'm around." Julia swallowed hard, his words settling in her chest. There was something in his eyes, something that made her believe him, and yet, a part of her still couldn't let go of the past. The fear of Jason, the fear of being controlled, still lingered in her heart. "How do you know I can trust you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Adriano studied her for a moment, his gaze unwavering. "Because I'm offering you something you've never had before," he said, his voice low and steady. "The chance to make your own choices. The chance to live without looking over your shoulder every minute of the day." Julia felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But the scars from her past were deep, and trusting someone, especially someone like Adriano, was harder than she could have imagined. "I don't know how to live without fear," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to live for myself." Adriano's gaze softened, and he stood up, walking around the desk to stand beside her. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his touch surprisingly tender. "You will learn," he said quietly. "And you won't be alone in it. I'll help you. But you have to believe that you deserve this. You deserve peace, Julia. You deserve a life where you're not controlled by anyone." She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had never thought about her own worth, her own right to choose. She had spent so many years living for others, for Jason, that the idea of living for herself seemed foreign. But as Adriano's hand rested on her shoulder, she felt a shift inside her, something stirring. She didn't know where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. A hope that she could rebuild her life, a life where she was in control, a life where fear didn't dictate her every move. "I'm scared," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared of what comes next." Adriano squeezed her shoulder gently, offering her a reassuring smile. "That's okay," he said softly. "Fear is natural, but it doesn't have to control you. You're not alone anymore, Julia. I'm here." And for the first time in a long time, Julia believed him. Julia sat by the large window, gazing out at the mansion's grounds. The sun had begun to set, casting an orange glow across the garden. Despite the beauty of the scene before her, she couldn't escape the whirlwind of emotions inside her. It had been nearly a week since she'd stepped into this new life, yet it felt like only yesterday she had been running from the life she once knew. A life where fear had ruled her every waking moment. Now, she was surrounded by luxury, by safety, but she still felt lost. Adriano's promise to protect her had been comforting, but the weight of it all still pressed down on her chest. She didn't know how to let go of her past, how to embrace the new freedom he offered. For so long, she had been nothing more than a prisoner in her own home. Jason had controlled every aspect of her life, from what she wore to who she spoke to. His threats and anger had become her reality, and now, as she stood in this mansion, she was struggling to adjust. She had never truly lived for herself. She had always been told what to do, where to go, and how to behave. The thought of living on her own terms was both liberating and terrifying. A soft knock on the door broke her thoughts. She turned, her heart skipping a beat as the door opened, and Adriano stepped inside. His presence immediately filled the room, strong and commanding, but there was something different about the way he looked at her today. It wasn't just power that radiated from him now. There was a warmth, a softness, that made Julia feel like maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. "You're quiet today," he said, his voice steady but gentle. Julia didn't know how to respond. She had spent so many days keeping her emotions locked away, and now, with him standing there, she felt vulnerable. She had so many questions, so many doubts, but the one question that lingered in her mind was simple. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping me? What do you want from me?" Adriano stood silently for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. Finally, he walked over to where she sat by the window and stood beside her, his gaze following hers as they both looked out at the garden. "What do I want?" he repeated softly, almost to himself. "I want you to be free, Julia. I want you to live without fear." Julia turned her head to look at him, her heart racing. "But what does that mean for me?" she asked. "What happens when I'm free? What does life look like after living in fear for so long?" Adriano's eyes softened, and he placed a hand on the back of the chair she was sitting in, his fingers brushing against her shoulder. "It means you get to make your own choices. It means you get to decide who you are, what you want, and how you live." Julia swallowed hard, her throat tightening. She had never had that kind of power, that kind of control over her own life. She had always been forced to follow someone else's rules. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know how to live for myself." Adriano's expression softened even more. "You don't have to do it alone," he said. "I'm here to help you, Julia. You have all the time you need. I'm not asking you to change overnight, but I am asking you to trust that you have the strength inside you to start living for yourself." Julia closed her eyes, feeling a tear slip down her cheek. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel ashamed of her tears. She felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. Maybe, just maybe, she could start to trust again. Maybe she could start to trust herself. Adriano stepped back, giving her space, and she wiped her eyes, feeling a little more like herself. "What happens next?" she asked, her voice still soft but steadier than before. Adriano smiled, a genuine smile this time, and it made her heart skip a beat. "Next, we start fresh," he said. "We'll take things slowly, step by step. There's no rush." Julia nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Slowly, she began to understand. The world he was offering her wasn't one where she had to conform to someone else's demands. It was a world where she could make her own choices, where her past didn't have to dictate her future. Adriano stepped closer again, his eyes intense but gentle. "You are safe here, Julia. No one will hurt you. But it's more than that. You're free. You can be whoever you want to be." Julia looked into his eyes, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She was free, and for the first time, she felt like she could breathe. "Thank you," she whispered, the words feeling like the first step in a new life. Adriano gave her a nod, his face softening as he turned to leave the room. "We'll talk more soon," he said, his voice lingering in the air. Julia watched him go, her heart still racing, but for the first time in a long time, it was racing with excitement, not fear. The freedom she had longed for was finally within reach. And this time, it was hers to claim. Julia spent the next few days in a strange mix of quiet contemplation and subtle adjustment. She had heard Adriano's words, felt the sincerity in his voice, but trusting him, trusting this new life, was not something she could do overnight. It was easier said than done, living without fear, without the looming presence of someone who controlled her every move. She found herself wrestling with doubts, questioning whether this freedom was real, or if she was just being pulled into a new form of control. But there was something different about Adriano. His calmness, his unshakable confidence, was not just about power. It was about protection. He made her feel like she had a choice, something she had never truly had before. He had offered her more than just safety. He had offered her a life where she could make her own decisions. The mansion, with its cold marble floors and towering walls, felt more like a prison to her than a sanctuary at times. But every day, as she spent more time in its expansive rooms, she began to see the possibilities of what her future could hold. There was no one watching her, no one telling her what to wear or when to speak. For the first time in years, she was living for herself. Adriano had been patient with her, giving her space when she needed it. But she knew their conversations weren't finished. She needed to understand what was really going on, what he expected from her, and why he had chosen to protect her. The moment came one afternoon when he invited her to his office. She hadn't been inside yet, but the sheer presence of the room, large, imposing, yet meticulously organized, spoke volumes about who he was. Adriano was a man who valued control, but it wasn't just over people. It was over his environment, his decisions, his destiny. Julia stepped inside, her heart racing with 1,000 questions. He looked up from his desk as she entered, offering her a quiet nod of acknowledgement. There was no intimidation in his eyes, just the steady calm that always seemed to surround him. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Julia did as instructed, but this time, she didn't feel like she was being commanded. This time, she felt like she had a choice. "I know you have questions," Adriano began, his voice calm and measured, "and I think it's time we address them." She looked at him, taking a deep breath. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "You didn't owe me anything." Adriano's eyes softened, but his gaze didn't waver. "Because you deserve better, Julia," he said simply. "No one should have to live in fear. You've spent years trapped by someone else's control. That's not a life. I'm offering you the opportunity to live on your own terms." Julia swallowed hard. The words were still so new to her. Live on her own terms. She had never really thought about what that could mean. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted. "I've spent so long letting someone else decide for me." Adriano leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "You will learn," he said. "It takes time, but you have the strength inside you. I can help guide you, but the choices are yours. The life you want is yours to create." Julia looked at him, trying to process everything he had just said. She didn't know if she was ready for this, for the weight of her own decisions. But she could feel the truth in his words. She could feel the possibility of a future where she wasn't trapped. "What do you expect from me?" she asked, still uncertain. Adriano smiled slightly, a rare warmth in his eyes. "Nothing," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I'm offering you a chance. What you do with it is entirely up to you." His words settled in her chest, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt the weight of her past begin to lift. She didn't have to follow someone else's rules anymore. She didn't have to live in fear. "I don't know if I can do it," she said, her voice quiet. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." Adriano stood, walking around the desk to stand beside her. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You've already taken the hardest step. You've left him. Now, you can start to rebuild. I'll be here, every step of the way." Julia looked up at him, her chest tight with emotion. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in that moment, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. She didn't have to figure it all out by herself. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Adriano gave her a small, knowing smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "But I'm glad you're here." As he walked away, Julia sat there in silence, the weight of his words settling deep. Inside her, she had been given a chance, a real chance at a life she had never dared to dream of. She didn't know where it would lead, but for the first time, She felt like she was finally in control of her own destiny. And that, she realized, was all she needed to start building the life she had always deserved. The days that followed were a mixture of calm and quiet adjustment. Julia spent her mornings walking around the mansion, trying to get used to the emptiness that had replaced the constant tension of her old life. Adriano had kept his word. She was no longer afraid, and the mansion was as quiet as she wanted it to be. For the first time, Julia had a chance to breathe. The past few months had been a blur of fear, of trying to hold everything together. But now, for the first time, she had space to think. There were still moments when doubt crept in. What was Adriano's real motive? Was he offering her freedom, or was she just a part of a bigger plan? She had no answers. She didn't even know where to start asking the right questions. One evening, Adriano came to her with an unexpected offer. They were seated in the large, open living room of the mansion, the flickering fire casting shadows on the walls. The room, though grand, still felt strangely personal when the two of them were together. Adriano leaned forward, his expression as calm as ever. "You're adjusting well," he said, his voice steady. "But I know you still have questions, and I want to give you the answers you need." Julia felt her chest tighten slightly. She had been thinking about her past, her life with Jason, what she had left behind, and what was ahead. But she hadn't yet voiced those fears. "What do you mean?" she asked. "What kind of answers do you mean?" Adriano's gaze softened, his usual stern demeanor slipping just enough to show the understanding that had always been there. "The world I live in, Julia," he began, "it's not one you know. It's not the world you came from." Julia frowned slightly. She had already begun to realize that. But there was still so much she didn't understand. "You mean the Mafia world," she said, almost to herself. Adriano gave a slight nod. "Yes," he replied. "The world I run is dangerous. It's complicated. But I've made it clear that you don't have to be a part of that. You're here to live a different life. A life where you're free." The words felt like a lifeline, but Julia wasn't sure if she could believe them completely. "But how does it work?" she asked, her voice quiet. "What do you want from me?" Adriano leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he regarded her. "Nothing," he said simply. "I want nothing from you. You're here because you deserve better. You deserve a life free from fear, from manipulation, from control." Julia's chest tightened at the mention of control. It was something she knew all too well. Her life had been shaped by someone else's demands, someone else's rules. But now, she was given a chance to choose, and it terrified her. "What if I don't know how to live without fear?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Adriano's gaze softened, his eyes narrowing slightly in empathy. "You will learn," he said gently. "Fear has ruled your life for too long, but it doesn't have to rule you anymore. You are stronger than you realize." Julia looked away, staring into the flickering flames. It was hard to believe she had any strength left after everything that had happened. "I don't know if I can trust myself," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I've spent so long living for someone else, doing what they wanted, that I don't know who I am without that." Adriano's voice remained steady, but there was a quiet force behind his words. "You'll find out who you are, Julia," he said. "And I'll help you. You don't have to do it alone. You have the power to shape your own future." The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Julia could feel the weight of his words settling in her chest. For so long, she had lived in the shadow of someone else's desires, but now, she could see a glimmer of something new, something better, something that was hers to control. Adriano stood up then, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. "Take your time," he said, his voice softer now. "But remember this. You don't have to be anyone's prisoner anymore. Not his, not anyone's." Julia nodded, her mind still racing with the implications of everything Adriano had said. For the first time in a long time, she felt something stir inside her, the faintest hope that her future could be different. Adriano turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he paused and looked back at her. "You're not alone in this, Julia. I will make sure of that." With that, he left the room, and Julia was left in the quiet of the mansion, still unsure of what the future held. But for the first time, she was beginning to feel like maybe, just maybe, she had the power to shape it for herself. The final morning inside the mansion arrived with a stillness Julia had grown used to, but this time, the quiet carried a different weight. For weeks, She had lived within these walls, healing, learning, slowly recognizing the strength she had buried deep inside herself. The fear that once controlled her had begun to lose its grip, replaced by something steady and unfamiliar: hope. She walked down the grand staircase, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, illuminating the marble floors beneath her feet. Every step echoed softly, but the sound no longer intimidated her. She did not shrink into herself any longer. She was no longer walking like someone bracing for impact. She was walking like someone who belonged in her own life. Adriano stood in the main hall, speaking quietly to one of his men. When he noticed her approaching, his expression softened, the sternness in his eyes replaced by something warmer, something more human. He dismissed his guard with a nod and turned fully toward Julia. "You look stronger today," he said, his voice steady and calm. Julia took a breath, feeling the truth in his words. "I feel stronger," she replied. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like myself again." Adriano studied her for a moment, as if measuring the strength she spoke of. Then he nodded, almost proudly. "Good," he said, "because there is something I want to talk to you about." Julia felt her heartbeat quicken, but not from fear this time. She followed him into the study, the room where so many of their conversations had shaped her new understanding of freedom. He closed the door gently behind them, then turned to face her. "You came here broken," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not because you were weak, but because someone tried to take your strength away." Julia looked down, remembering the woman she had been, small, afraid, silenced. But she lifted her chin again, meeting his gaze with newfound steadiness. "And now?" she asked quietly. Adriano stepped closer, stopping just a few feet from her. "Now," he said, "you're not the same woman who walked into that restaurant with him. You're not the woman who flinched at every raised voice. You're not the woman who believed she deserved to live in fear." He let those words linger in the quiet room. Julia felt her throat tighten, emotion rising unexpectedly. She had never imagined anyone would see her this way, as someone capable of strength, of rebuilding. "Someone worthy," she whispered. "I did not think I would ever find a life outside of fear." Adriano nodded slowly. "Fear has shaped too many years of your life, Julia. And you have a choice now. A real one." Her breath caught. A choice. The very thing she had never truly been given. "What choice?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. Adriano held her gaze. "The choice to stay," he said simply, "or to leave. The world outside these walls is yours again. You can start fresh, anywhere you choose. You can build a life independent of anyone's control, even mine. I promised you freedom, and that includes freedom from me." Julia felt as if the air had been knocked from her chest, but not from fear. From realization. This was not a cage disguised as safety. It was exactly what he had promised, a place to heal until she was ready to step into her own life again. "You would let me go?" she asked quietly. "If that is what you choose," he replied. "Your life is yours. Every step you take from now on is yours to decide." Her eyes stung, tears forming not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling of finally being seen. Truly seen. She looked around the study, remembering every moment she had spent in this room, afraid, uncertain, lost. And now, she stood tall, strong, choosing. "I do want a new life," she said softly. "One where I am not afraid, where I make my own decisions." Adriano's expression did not falter. There was only respect in his eyes. "Then that is the life you will have." Julia took a slow breath. "But I want to start it my way, on my own terms." Adriano nodded once. "As it should be." She stepped toward him, not in fear, but with gratitude etched across her features. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me the chance to remember who I am." Adriano's voice was quieter now, but anchored in certainty. "You did that yourself, Julia. I only gave you space to find it." With one last look, she turned and walked toward the door. Her steps were steady, her heart calm. She wasn't running away this time. She was walking into her future, free, strong, and finally, truly herself. And as she reached the doorway, she heard Adriano's voice one last time, soft but certain. "Julia, wherever you go, live without fear." She nodded, not looking back, because she no longer needed to. As she stepped outside the mansion into the bright, open day, she felt her heart open to possibilities she had once believed were impossible. She had left behind the shadows of her past, and now she was walking into the light of her own life. Her first life, her true life, her free life. In this dark romance, a woman trapped in an abusive marriage finds herself caught between a past of fear and a future filled with uncertainty. After years of living under control and fear, she is given the chance to escape and start anew, thanks to a mysterious mafia boss who offers her safety and freedom. As the story unfolds, she must decide whether to trust the man who saved her and what kind of life she will build for herself. The dark romance explores themes of freedom, trust, and rebuilding one's life after trauma. It delves into the emotional turmoil of leaving a toxic relationship and the complex dynamics of a relationship with a powerful man. With a promise of protection and no strings attached, she must confront her past while facing the potential for a future filled with new challenges and opportunities. In this dark romance, she is faced with a choice: to stay and embrace a new life or to walk away and find her own path. This journey through pain, healing, and self-discovery explores the depths of vulnerability and strength, showing that even in the most controlling situations, the possibility for personal growth and freedom can emerge. As the dark romance progresses, the woman's internal struggle with trust and independence intensifies, making for a compelling and gripping story. Ultimately, the question remains: can she truly start over, or will the shadows of her past continue to haunt her? This dark romance is an emotional roller coaster that highlights the importance of reclaiming one's life and finding strength in the face of overwhelming odds.